The morning fog hung thick over London as Marcus Thompson stepped off the bus near Buckingham Palace. His worn sneakers squeaked against the wet pavement, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a crumpled piece of paper. The 23-year-old construction worker had been out of a job for 3 months, and the eviction notice in his pocket felt heavier than the tools. Marcus had always been fascinated by the royal guards. As a child, he would press his face against the palace gates, watching these stoic figures in their red tunics and tall black hats stand perfectly still for hours. His grandmother used to tell him stories about how they protected the queen, how they were trained to be unbreakable, unmovable forces of discipline and honor. Today was different, though. Today Marcus felt desperate and angry. The system had failed him, he thought. He had worked hard all his life, paid his taxes, followed the rules, and where had it gotten him? Nowhere. Meanwhile, these guards stood protecting a palace filled with unimaginable wealth, while ordinary people like him struggled to keep a roof over their heads. The crowd of tourists began to gather as the morning progressed. Families with cameras, excited children pointing at the guards, and elderly couples sharing stories of their previous visits to London. Marcus found himself pushed toward the front of the crowd, directly facing one of the guards who stood motionless at his post. The guard was tall and imposing, his red uniform immaculate, its expression hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. His rifle was held at the perfect angle, and not even the slightest twitch betrayed any human emotion. To Marcus, he represented everything that was wrong with the world, rigid authority that ignored the struggles of common people. As Marcus stared at the guard, his frustration began to boil over. The voices in the crowd seemed to fade away, and all he could hear was the sound of his own rapid heartbeat. The eviction notice crinkled in his pocket as his fist clenched around it. He thought about his small apartment, the only place he had ever called home since his grandmother passed away 5 years ago. Something snapped inside Marcus. Without thinking clearly, he took a step forward, then another. The tourists around him began to notice his strange behavior, but he was too focused on the guard to care. His mind raced with thoughts of injustice, of a system that protected the wealthy while abandoning people like him. The guard remained perfectly still. Marcus could swear he saw the slightest shift in the man's posture. It was as if the guard sensed something was about to happen, though his training kept him from showing any obvious reaction. The tension in the air was almost electric, and several tourists began to step back. Sensing that something was wrong, Marcus took one more step forward, his eyes locked on the guard's face. In his desperate state of mind, he convinced himself that if he could just get through to one of these symbols of authority, maybe someone would finally listen to his story. Maybe someone would care about what happened to ordinary people who were struggling to survive in an increasingly difficult world. The moment Marcus lunged forward, time seemed to slow down. His shoulder connected with the guard's chest. But instead of the dramatic collision he had imagined, something unexpected happened. The guard, whose name was James Patterson, had been watching Marcus from the corner of his eye for several minutes. His 20 years of military training had taught him to read people, and he recognized the signs of someone in deep emotional distress. Instead of fighting back or calling for immediate backup, James did something that surprised everyone, including himself. As Marcus crashed into him, James allowed himself to be pushed back slightly, absorbing the impact while maintaining his balance. His strong hands came up, not to strike, but to steady both himself and the desperate young man who had just attacked him. The crowd gasped, and several people screamed. Phones came out immediately as tourists began recording what they thought would be a violent confrontation. Security personnel started moving toward the scene, their hands reaching for their radios and weapons. But James held up one hand in a subtle signal that meant wait, a gesture that his fellow officers recognized from their shared training. Marcus found himself face to face with the guard, expecting anger or violence in return. Instead, he looked into James's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: understanding. James was a 42-year-old veteran who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Before joining the Royal Guard, he had seen enough broken people to recognize. The look in Marcus's eyes wasn't the look of a criminal or a troublemaker. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of their rope. "Easy, son," James said quietly, so only Marcus could hear. His voice was calm but firm, with a slight Scottish accent that made it somehow more reassuring. "What's your name?" Marcus was stunned. He had expected to be tackled, arrested, or worse. Instead, this guard was talking to him like a human being. His anger began to crumble, replaced by confusion and unexpected shame. He whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd. James could see the security team getting closer, and he knew they only had moments before this situation would escalate beyond his control. He had to make a quick decision. His training said to neutralize the threat and wait for backup. His instincts as a human being told him something different entirely. "Marcus, I need you to step back slowly," James continued, still maintaining his professional posture while speaking in low, calming tones. "Can you do that for me? Nobody needs to get hurt here." The crowd had grown larger, and people were pushing closer to get a better view or a better video angle. James could hear sirens in the distance, which meant someone had called the police. Time was running out for whatever was going to happen next. Marcus looked around at all the faces staring at him, at all the phones pointed in his direction, and suddenly realized what he had done. The gravity of attacking a royal guard at Buckingham Palace began to sink in. His legs felt weak, and he might have collapsed if not for James's steady presence in front of him. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I'm so sorry. I just ... I don't know what to do anymore." James saw something in that moment that would change both of their lives forever. James Patterson made a decision that would go against every protocol in his training manual. As the security team approached and the police sirens grew louder, he did something that stunned everyone watching. He slowly removed his bearskin hat and placed it on the ground beside him, then took off his ceremonial gloves. This simple act transformed him from an untouchable symbol of royal authority into just a man standing before another man who clearly needed help. The crowd fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the security officers slowed their approach, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation. James placed his hand gently on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that would later be captured in dozens of photographs and videos that would spread across social media within hours. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully," James said, his voice still calm but now filled with genuine warmth. "Whatever brought you here today, whatever made you feel like this was your only option, I want you to know that it's not. There are people who can help you, and there are always other ways forward." Marcus looked up at James with tears streaming down his face. He'd expected punishment, rejection, and humiliation. Instead, this guard was treating him with more kindness than anyone had shown him in months. The contrast between what he had expected and what was actually happening began to break down the walls of anger and desperation he had built around himself. "I lost my job," Marcus said between sobs. "I'm getting evicted. I don't have anyone. My grandmother died, and she was all I had. I thought maybe if I could make someone notice, maybe someone would care about what happens to people like me." James understood more than Marcus could possibly know. After returning from his military service, James had gone through his own dark period. He had struggled with depression, unemployment, and the feeling that society had forgotten about veterans like him. The structure and purpose of joining the Royal Guard had literally saved his life by giving him a reason to get up every morning in a community that understood his experiences. The police arrived and began pushing through the crowd. But James held up his hand again, this time more firmly. His sergeant, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, made a decision to trust his veteran guards. Judgment. He spoke quietly to the police officers, asking them to wait and see how the situation developed. "Marcus, I served in Afghanistan," James continued. "When I came back, I felt lost too. I felt angry at a world that seemed to go on as if nothing had happened while some of us were struggling just to find our place again. I know what it feels like to think that nobody cares whether you succeed or fail." The crowd around them had grown to over 100 people, but somehow the space immediately around James and Marcus felt intimate and private. Other royal guards had taken positions to manage the crowd, but they too seemed to sense that something important was happening that shouldn't be interrupted. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It was his personal business card, something he carried not in his official capacity as a guard, but as a volunteer with a veterans charity that helped people find work and housing. He pressed it into Marcus's hand. "This isn't over for you," James said with quiet intensity. "Your story doesn't end here, and it doesn't end with you feeling like you don't matter. Because you do matter, Marcus. Every person matters, and every person deserves a chance to build something better." The police officers were getting impatient, and James knew he couldn't delay the inevitable much longer. But he had one more thing he needed to say. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in the history of the Royal Guard. James looked directly at his sergeant, then at the police officers, and made an announcement that left everyone speechless. "I'm not pressing charges," he said clearly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This young man made a mistake, but he's not a criminal. He's someone who needs help, not punishment." The police officers looked confused. Attacking a royal guard was a serious offense, and they had procedures to follow. But James continued speaking, this time addressing the crowd of onlookers who had been recording everything. "My name is James Patterson, and I've been a royal guard for 8 years. I've served my country in war and in peace, and I've learned that real strength isn't about standing still and looking impressive. Real strength is about knowing when to extend a helping hand to someone who needs it." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only was this guard not angry with him, but he was actively protecting him from the legal consequences of what he had done. The kindness was overwhelming. Marcus found himself unable to speak through his tears. James turned back to Marcus and spoke more quietly, but his words carried across the silent crowd. "I want you to call the number on that card tomorrow morning. There's a man named David Chen who runs a program that helps people get back on their feet. Tell him James Patterson sent you, and tell him your story. He'll help you find work, and he'll help you find a place to live." The sergeant stepped forward and spoke briefly with the police officers. After several minutes of discussion, they agreed to let Marcus go with a warning, provided he left the area immediately and promised to seek the help that James had offered. It was highly unusual, but the sergeant recognized that James had handled the situation better than anyone could have expected. As Marcus prepared to leave, something remarkable happened. Several people in the crowd began approaching him, not with anger or judgment, but with offers of help. An elderly woman pressed 20 pounds into his hand. A businessman gave him his business card and said he might have work available. Young mother with children offered to bring him a hot meal if he needed it. Word of what had happened began spreading on social media immediately. Videos of the encounter showed James removing his hat and speaking gently to Marcus, then publicly defending him and offering help instead of seeking punishment. The hashtag #RealStrength began trending within hours, people sharing the story and praising James for his compassion, but the story was far from over. As Marcus walked away from Buckingham Palace, he found himself followed by several journalists who had heard about the incident. Instead of hiding from them, he decided to speak openly about what had brought him to that desperate moment and how James's kindness had changed everything. "I thought the world didn't care about people like me," Marcus told a reporter from the BBC. The thighs said, I say, But that guard, James, he showed me that there are still good people in the world who will help a stranger even when that stranger has done something wrong. Meanwhile, James returned to his post, put his hat back on, and resumed his duties. But inside, he felt different. He had broken protocol, but he had also potentially saved a life and definitely changed one. His fellow guards nodded at him with respect and approval. They understood that he had represented the best of what they were supposed to stand for. The ripple effects of those few minutes were just beginning to be felt. The next morning, Marcus Thompson sat in his small bedsit with James's business card in his hands, staring at the phone number. The events of the previous day felt almost like a dream, but the card was real proof that it had all happened.
What?
Eviction notice was still on his table. But somehow it didn't feel quite as threatening as it had before. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus dialed the number. A cheerful voice answered on the second ring. "Good morning. This is David Chen from New Beginnings Support Services. How can I help you today?" "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said nervously. "James Patterson told me to call you. He said you might be able to help me." There was a brief pause. Then David's voice became more animated. "Marcus, James called me last night and told me all about you. I've been expecting your call. Can you come in to see me this afternoon? I think we can definitely find some solutions for your situation." Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, James was discovering that his act of compassion had consequences he never could have anticipated. His commanding officer called him into a private meeting, and James prepared himself for a disciplinary hearing. Instead, he found himself facing something entirely different. "Patterson, what you did yesterday was completely against protocol." The officer began sternly. James braced himself for punishment. "However, it was also exactly the kind of leadership and human decency that makes me proud to serve alongside you. You've brought more positive attention to the Royal Guard in one day than we usually get in a year." James was stunned. The officer continued. "We've had calls from 3 different charities asking if you'd be willing to speak at their events. The Palace press office says they've never had so many positive stories about the guards in the newspapers. And there's something else." The officer handed James a handwritten letter on expensive stationery. "This came through official channels this morning." James opened the letter and read it with growing amazement. It was from a member of the royal family, thanking him for exemplifying the values of service and compassion that the Royal Guard was meant to represent. The letter praised his quick thinking and his ability to turn a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of human connection that had inspired thousands of people. That afternoon, Marcus met David Chen at a small office. In central London, David was an energetic man in his 50s who had started his charity after his own experience with homelessness years earlier. He listened carefully as Marcus told his story, taking notes and occasionally asking gentle questions. "Marcus, I think we can help you," David said when Marcus finished. "First, let's deal with the immediate crisis. I have a contact with a housing association who can help with emergency accommodation while we work on something more permanent. Second, I know several construction companies who are actively looking for skilled workers. With your experience, I think we can have you working again within 2 weeks." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." David smiled. "Because James Patterson called me and told me you were worth helping. And James has never been wrong about people. Also because everyone deserves a second chance, and sometimes we all need someone to believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves." Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. The video of James removing his hat and speaking gently to Marcus had been viewed over 2 million times. People began sharing their own stories of times when strangers had shown them unexpected kindness during difficult moments in their lives. A fund was set up to help people in situations similar to Marcus's, and donations poured in from around the world. James found himself invited to speak at schools and community centers about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Marcus received a letter from his former employer, offering him his job back with a raise and an apology for the way his layoff had been handled. They had seen the news coverage and realized they had let go of a good employee during a difficult time in his life. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood outside Buckingham Palace once again, but this time, everything was different. He was wearing a clean suit that he had bought with money from his new job as a site supervisor for a construction company that David Chin had connected him with. In his hands, he carried a small wrapped package and a letter. James Patterson was at his usual post, standing tall and proud in his red uniform and bearskin hat. When he spotted Marcus approaching, James allowed himself the smallest of smiles, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. Marcus waited patiently with the crowd of tourists, and when James's shift ended and another guard took his place, the two men walked to a quiet corner of the palace grounds. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," James said, shaking Marcus's hand warmly.
Hi.
"Had to," Marcus replied. "I needed to thank you properly, and I wanted to show you what your kindness made possible." Marcus handed James the package, which contained a framed photograph. It showed Marcus standing in front of a small apartment building, holding a set of keys and grinning widely. On the back of the frame, he had written, "My new home made possible by one person who chose to see the best in me instead of the worst." "Thank you, James. I got my own place," Marcus explained. "One bedroom, nothing fancy, but it's mine. I'm back to work, doing what I love. But more than that, I'm volunteering with David's organization now, helping other people who find themselves in situations like I was in. It turns out that when someone saves your life, you want to spend the rest of it helping to save others." James looked at the photograph and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the heavy ceremonial uniform he wore. "I'm proud of you, Marcus, but you did all the hard work. I just gave you a phone number." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You did so much more than that. When I charged at you that day, I was expecting you to knock me down, arrest me, make me pay. For being stupid and desperate, instead, you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You treated me like I mattered when I felt like I didn't matter to anyone." The two men sat on a bench and talked for over an hour. James learned that Marcus had not only gotten back on his feet, but had also reconnected with some distant relatives who had reached out after seeing him on the news. Marcus learned that James had been promoted and was now helping to train new royal guards, the special emphasis on de-escalation and community relations. "There's something else," Marcus said as they prepared to part ways. "David's organization is expanding. We're starting a program specifically for veterans who are struggling with the transition to civilian life. I know it's not the same as what you went through, but David thought you might want to be involved. Maybe help us train counselors or speak to groups about your experiences." James was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that very much. It feels like the right way to use what I've learned." As they walked back toward the palace, Marcus asked the question that had been on his mind for months. "James, what made you decide to help me that day instead of just doing your job and letting me get arrested?" James thought carefully before answering. "I've asked myself that same question many times. I think it was because I recognized something in your eyes that I had felt before. The look of someone who had been trying to do the right thing for a long time but felt like the world had stopped caring whether they succeeded or failed. I remember feeling like that after I came back from deployment. And I remember how much it meant when just one person took the time to really see me and offer genuine help. They reached the palace gates where their paths would diverge. Would return to his new life, and James would return to his duties as a royal guard. But both men knew that they had been forever changed by those few minutes when compassion had triumphed over protocol and understanding had overcome judgment. "Same time next month?" Marcus asked. "Same time next month," James agreed. As Marcus walked away, several tourists approached James and asked if they could take pictures with him. He agreed, as he always did, but now he saw these interactions differently. Each person who wanted to meet a royal guard was someone with their own story, their own struggles, and their own hopes. And sometimes, just sometimes, a moment of genuine human connection could change everything. The story of Marcus Thompson and James Patterson had become legend, shared in schools and community centers as an example of how one act of kindness can create ripples that extend far beyond what anyone could imagine. But for the two men who lived it, it was simply a reminder that in a world that can sometimes feel cold and indifferent, there are still people willing to choose compassion over convenience, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair.